The African Securities Exchanges Association Commission held its 22nd annual meeting and conference in Lagos, Nigeria, themed Champions on the Rise. The conference brought together policymakers, global investors, CEOs, government officials, amongst others from across Africa. Declaring open the conference was the Vice President of Nigeria, Professor Yemi Osibanjo.
It's evident that the African Securities Exchange Association has a key role in our continental quest for economic growth and development. This is not only because of the vital role that capital markets play in our domestic economies, but because the association reflects the right spirit of collaboration and partnership that is required of African countries and their economic institutions to bring about a more vibrant, more dynamic continental economy. Africa, through its talents, its businesses and commerce, is on the rise. Africa, as we all know, is the last frontier for virgin economic opportunities. And given the recent positive developments on the continent, it's only a question of time before the abundant opportunities on the continent bring about major socioeconomic changes. At the same time, our theme reminds us that the path of development, which worked for many of the advanced countries and leading emerging economies, especially their indulgence in environmentally damaging industrial practices, may no longer be sustainable. And this means that the past pathways to growth and prosperity may no longer be easy to replicate. In other words, Africa's rise is to some extent going to be determined by an unbeaten path. And there lies the high, significant challenges, but also the great opportunities that we face today. Much has been said already since the turn of the millennium about the relatively high growth rates in Africa, such that amongst us, we're already seeing so much optimism about the continent and the potential pull for global growth. The global economic and financial crisis and the end of the commodity boom seem to have tempered that exuberance somewhat. But there's still a lot to be said about Africa's positive trajectory. Several African countries, including those that are not rich in natural resources, continue to do very well. And we also have a transformed outlook to democracy, to accountability, and anti-corruption on the continent. Not quite 2 decades ago, the words accountability, anti-corruption, democracy almost seemed like bad words. But now there's hardly any African country today where elections are not considered commonplace. And this year, the African Union has been declared the African Union's year of anti-corruption, with our president, President Muhammadu Buhari, as its champion. All of us in African governments, in private firms, in market institutions, must be the champions on the rise. And we have a duty and responsibility to assure a sustainable future on this beautiful continent.
Aruma Ote, Vice President and Treasurer at the World Bank, had a keynote presentation on positioning African exchanges to attract global flows.
Africa's wealth is indeed its people, if properly harnessed. I believe that if we build infrastructure, and particularly climate-smart infrastructure, that if we diversify African economies beyond commodities and extraction of natural resources, if we focus on areas of opportunities that are bound in Africa, whether in agriculture, in services, in retail, hospitality, financial services, technology, particularly emerging technologies, in sustainability more broadly, and I'm glad that you're spending a session focused on sustainability, that we must also foster innovation and entrepreneurship. And I believe that securities exchanges are the epicenter of the ecosystem that will enable all that I have highlighted happen. This is because, in my view, securities exchanges are the visible symbols of the multidimensional roles that capital markets play in society. As The acting director general and the representative of the SEC Nigeria and the representative of the Minister of Finance highlighted capital markets mobilize resources and are therefore a source of medium to long-term finance for financing key government priorities such as infrastructure, and for new businesses and for expanding existing businesses. They also provide various vehicles for wealth creation, for institutional and retail investors, for domestic and foreign flows alike. They enable merit-based allocation of resources and wealth distribution, particularly in an environment where you have such huge inequalities as we face in Africa. They also foster transparency, accountability, and good corporate governance. They, of course, promote innovation, entrepreneurship, and job creation. Let me briefly review two examples. One focusing on Africa's energy deficit, and the second on entrepreneurship. As you know, 600 million Africans live today without access to electricity. The average electrification rate in sub-Saharan Africa is 35%, and it's even as low as 20% in remote areas. Africa's installed capacity is currently 147 gigawatts, of which 45 gigawatts is actually South Africa alone, compared to Spain, that is 105 gigawatts. Significant untapped renewable potential exists, as we all know, whether it be solar, hydropower, geothermal, or wind. I do feel that securities exchanges must become more engaged in finding solutions to this perennial problem that many African countries have. Whether it's to help in fostering regional integration, because there is, of course, fragmentation, so that the examples we've seen of power pools can be replicated. This will save us $40 billion in capital spending and save the African consumer nearly $10 billion per year by 2040. And as the levelized cost of energy falls from $70 per megawatt hour to $64 per megawatt hour, as McKinsey has pointed out. Privatization of the 39 utilities, most of them currently financially not viable, could release additional investment opportunities, release physical space for governments to focus on things like human capital development. The second area that I want to share with you is about nurturing entrepreneurship, nurturing the many micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises that we have. I understand that there are 44 million micro and small-scale enterprises, micro, small-scale, and medium enterprises, 44 million. So if we had a pipeline of 0.1% of that we plan for listing, that would be 44,000 African companies that could make their way onto securities exchanges. You know that SMEs are strong drivers of economic development, of innovation, of employment. But one of their greatest challenges is access to finance. Of course, I was pleased to learn in October at the World Federation of Exchanges meetings this year that there is important attention that securities exchanges around the world, including in Africa, and I know that the CEO of the Stock Exchange made a presentation about some of the transformational ways that you're looking at SMEs and supporting them. And I'm looking to see how we can do much more of that so that we can truly develop a pipeline of companies that can be listed on the exchanges in Africa.
Panel sessions were held.
What Access is doing and how technology is involved.
What put Blockbuster out of business was its business model. It used brick and mortar stores, which had a significant expense. It used physical delivery of the media, which is a physical expense. That took away from the revenues. They had to compete with Amazon and Netflix that streamed the media using the technology. So they used the technology, they compressed margins, but they had many more viewers at a smaller margin compared to Blockbuster, who had a small amount of viewers at a larger margin. But when you take the expense out of physical cassette tapes, the rent, the employees, Blockbuster couldn't compete. It is always, always going to be the business model. The challenge to exchanges and the challenges to banks, again, are not going to be it's not going to be the technology, it's going to be the business model.
Other participants and speakers included Ms. Nadini Sukuma.
We exist to speak to regulators around the world about the consequences of their actions on emerging markets, such as those here in the room today.
If the African is given the platform, they can be world beaters. And certainly, if you look at banking, if you look at what Aliko is doing in cement, insofar as the African entrepreneur has access to capital, they can build companies that are world-class.
Some notable points included how the various exchanges can further support a pipeline of small businesses which can be listed on their platforms. Irene Ubani for Plus TV Africa.